The first watch Grant held up was our father's 1962 Omega Seamaster. The one with the hairline scratch across the crystal that Dad always said was from the day he almost dropped it into Lake Erie. "Reserve is 200, Grant announced to the crowd gathered around the folding tables in Aunt Marcy's backyard. Nora here got sentimental about a few of these, but let's be honest, folks. She never understood what any of this was actually worth. I stood at the edge of the tent with a manila folder pressed against my chest like a shield, watching my brother auction off the one thing our father had left specifically to me in writing, with his signature notarized 6 months before he died. 200 to start, Grant said, grinning at our cousin Todd. Do I hear 250? If you have ever watched someone rewrite your father's last wishes into a punchline, tell me in the comments how you got through it. And if this story is doing anything for you, hit subscribe before we go further, because it gets worse before it gets better. My name is Nora Whitcomb. I am 35 years old, and I work as a collections registrar at a museum in Cincinnati, which means I spend my days writing condition reports, tracking chain of custody, and making sure that when something valuable moves from one hand to another, there is a paper trail nobody can argue with later. I have handled Ming Dynasty porcelain and Civil War rifles, and a signed first edition that a donor's grandchildren tried to claim didn't exist. I know what provenance means. I know what a legal transfer looks like. And I never once thought I would need those skills at my own family summer reunion, standing under a rented tent in Aunt Marcy's backyard in July. Watching my brother turn our dead father's watch collection into a carnival game. To understand how we got there, you have to go back about 8 months, to the week after Dad's funeral. Dad had been a quiet man, the kind who fixed his own gutters and kept receipts for things he bought in 1987. He collected watches the way some men collect grudges, patiently, deliberately, and with more feeling than he ever let on. There were 11 pieces total. A Hamilton Railroad watch that had belonged to his own father, the Omega from Lake Erie. A Rolex Explorer he'd bought used the year I graduated college because he said explorers were for people who went places. And he wanted me to remember that even after he wasn't around to remind me. A handful of others, smaller, quieter pieces, each one with its own small history that only he seemed to remember in full. 2 months before he passed, when the diagnosis had already turned from hope into arithmetic, Dad sat me down at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a magnifying loupe and had me help him write out an inventory. Not a will amendment, not anything dramatic. Just a plain itemized list, 1 watch per line, condition notes, purchase history, and a single line under each one that said who it went to and why. I want it documented properly, he told me, sliding his reading glasses up his nose. You do this for a living. Do it for me. I laughed at the time because it felt strange to bring my job home like that. To sit at my father's table, cataloging his life the way I cataloged donor collections at work. But I did it. I photographed each piece. I wrote condition reports. For every watch, I attached a small tag, the kind we use at the museum, string-tied, with a printed accession number on the front and a handwritten note on the back. Dad signed each tag himself in his small, careful print. 10 of the 11 watches were designated to go to me, specifically by name, with the notation custodian and beneficiary, Nora Whitcomb, on the back of every tag. The 11th, a plain Timex he'd worn to work every day for 30 years, he left to Grant, because he needs something that reminds him to show up. I kept the tags, I kept the photographs. I kept a signed and dated inventory sheet in a fireproof folder in my apartment, along with the consignment paperwork Dad had drawn up with Mr. Calder, the local auctioneer he'd trusted for over a decade to appraise anything worth appraising. I never imagined I would need to produce any of it in front of 40 relatives holding paper plates of potato salad. The suffering, if I can call it that, started small. The first blow came 3 weeks after the funeral, when Mom called me crying, not about the watches, but about the box. "Grant took the box from the hall closet," she said, "the one with Dad's watches in it. He said he was going to get them appraised for the estate." I told her that was fine, that Mr. Calder had already appraised everything with Dad present, that there was documentation, that nothing needed to be reappraised. She didn't seem to hear me. Grief does that. It makes people agree to things just to make the noise stop. The second blow was a photograph Grant posted online 2 months later. Himself standing in front of an open velvet display case, 11 watches lined up like soldiers. Captioned, "Getting ready to make sure Dad's legacy is honored the right way." 43 likes. My Aunt Marcy commented a heart emoji. Nobody asked what the right way meant, or why the watches weren't with me, the person Dad had put in writing as their custodian. The third blow came when I called Grant directly and asked him to send back the inventory folder, the one with the notarized copies, so I could have my records complete. He told me he'd lost track of it in the move, and that I was being weird about paperwork for a bunch of old watches. I remember standing in my kitchen, holding the phone, staring at my own reflection in the microwave door, feeling something in my chest go very quiet and very cold. The fourth blow was smaller, but somehow sharper. I found out through a cousin's offhand comment at a bridal shower that Grant had told people I'd grabbed the good watches for myself and left him with nothing, which was such a complete inversion of what had actually happened that I laughed out loud in the middle of the cake table, which made everyone look at me like I was the strange one. The fifth blow was the invitation itself, the one to the reunion, which arrived with a printed program listing a schedule of events. And under Saturday afternoon, in cheerful cursive font, Family Heirloom Auction, hosted by Grant Whitcomb, benefiting the Whitcomb Family Scholarship Fund. Nobody had asked me if my father's watches could be used to fund a scholarship. Nobody had asked me anything. The sixth blow, the one that finally cracked something open in me, was the small brass loop. Dad's loop, the one he'd used to examine every watch face for 40 years, the one he'd held in his own hand while we made that inventory together. I went looking for it in the estate boxes Mom still had in her garage, wanting to keep it as the one small object Grant hadn't thought to claim, and it wasn't there. Mom said she thought Grant had taken it to go with the collection, so everything matched. A magnifying tool worth maybe $40? And somehow its absence hurt more than anything else, because it meant even the smallest, least valuable piece of my father had been swept into Grant's narrative without a second thought. I want to be honest about something. For a while, I tried to be reasonable. I called Grant twice more, keeping my voice level, explaining again that Dad had left a signed inventory, that the watches were legally mine, that this wasn't a matter of opinion or sentiment, but of documented fact. Grant's response, both times, was some version of the same sentence. "You're the one who makes everything about paperwork, Nora." Some of us actually loved him. That line stayed with me longer than it should have. I sat with it for a few days, turning it over, feeling the old childhood shape of it. The familiar accusation that my competence was a kind of coldness, that documenting love somehow proved I didn't feel it. And then something shifted. I remember the exact moment. I was standing in the museum's back office. Updating a donor file for a collection of 19th century pocket watches that had come to us through a similarly messy family situation. 3 siblings fighting over grandfather's estate. Each one insisting the others didn't understand real value. I looked at the accession folder in my hands, at the clean, undeniable paper trail that had settled that dispute in about 4 minutes flat once the museum's legal counsel produced it. And I thought, I have that. I have exactly that. I just haven't used it yet. I stopped pleading with Grant after that. I stopped trying to appeal to whatever sense of fairness I hoped still existed in him. Instead, I did what I do for a living. I documented. I pulled the fireproof folder and made 3 complete copies. I scanned every inventory tag, front and back, at high resolution, the kind of scan we use for insurance claims. I pulled the consignment agreement Dad had signed with Mr. Calder 18 months before he died, the one that specifically named the watches, listed serial numbers, and included Mr. Calder's professional appraisal notes in his own handwriting. I found the accession photographs I'd taken at Dad's kitchen table, time-stamped, showing each watch beside its corresponding tag. I printed a clean chronological timeline, the date Dad and I created the inventory, the date he signed it, the date it was notarized, the date Grant removed the box from Mom's closet, the date of the social media post. I laid it all out on my dining room table, like an exhibit, because that is exactly what it was. Then I called Mr. Calder. I hadn't spoken to him since the week of the funeral, when he'd sent a quiet, formal card that said simply, "Your father was a good customer and a better friend. Let me know if I can help." I hadn't taken him up on it because I hadn't wanted to believe I would need to. "Nora," he said when he picked up, and I could hear the genuine warmth in his voice. The kind that made me remember why Dad had trusted him for over a decade. "How are you holding up?" I told him everything. The box, the social media post, the scholarship fund program, the reunion invitation. I told him I had the signed inventory tags, the notarized documentation, the consignment paperwork with his own notes on it. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Grant asked me to run the auction," Mr. Calder said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Called me about 6 weeks ago. Said the family wanted to honor your father's memory by selling off some of his things for a scholarship fund." I didn't know the watches he meant were the same ones your father and I appraised together. He never mentioned that part. Would you have said yes if he had? Another pause. "No," he said simply. "I wouldn't have." Your father was very specific with me about those watches. He told me more than once that everything in that collection was going to you, and that if anyone ever tried to sell them without your say-so, I was to ask for documentation before I let a single bid go through. That's not just good business, Nora. That's what he asked of me directly, as a friend. I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months. "Are you still willing to run the auction?" "I already agreed to," he said. "But I run auctions by the rules, not by whoever shouts loudest. If you have documentation, bring it. I'll do what's right by your father, whatever that costs Grant socially. That's not my problem to manage." I asked him one more thing before we hung up, whether, as the licensed auctioneer, he had the authority to stop a sale mid-bid if legal ownership was in dispute. Not just the authority, he said, the obligation. No auctioneer worth his license sells property he has reason to believe isn't clear of dispute. If you can show me clean paperwork, I have every right and every reason to pull the item before the gavel comes down. I've done it before. I'll do it again. That was the moment the ground under me stopped shifting. I had spent months absorbing blow after blow, watching my father's memory get repackaged into my brother's applause line, feeling my own competence twisted into a character flaw. But I had documentation. I had a witness with professional authority and personal integrity. I had, in the most literal sense, receipts. I drove to Aunt Marcy's the morning of the reunion with the folder in a locked document case in my trunk. The kind we use to transport fragile loans between institutions. I did not bring it in right away. I wanted to see how far Grant intended to take it. The backyard was full by early afternoon. Folding chairs arranged in loose rows facing a card table draped in a plastic tablecloth printed with sunflowers. Watches arranged on black velvet Grant had clearly bought just for the occasion. Kids ran between legs with popsicles. Someone's dog kept trying to get under the dessert table. It was, in every visible way, a normal family reunion, which somehow made what was about to happen feel even stranger. Mr. Calder arrived at 1, professional as always, in a light gray suit despite the July heat, carrying his own case of auction supplies. A gavel he'd had since I was a child, a ledger, a small portable scale for weighing precious metals, if anyone asked. He caught my eye across the yard and gave me a small nod, the kind that says, "I remember what we discussed." Grant took the small stage area, really just the space in front of the dessert table, at 2 o'clock sharp, tapping a spoon against a glass of lemonade for attention. "Family," he said, beaming. "Thank you all for being here. Today isn't just about celebrating Dad's memory. It's about honoring it in a way that gives back. Every dollar raised this afternoon goes straight into the Whitcomb Family Scholarship Fund, so that future generations of this family can go further than Dad ever got to." Genuine, warm applause, because nobody there had any reason to doubt him. "Before we start," Grant continued, and this was the part that made my stomach drop, "I want to introduce my sister Nora." He gestured toward me with an easy smile, the kind that had gotten him out of trouble our entire childhood. Nora's a museum registrar, believe it or not, spends her whole life cataloging other people's stuff. A ripple of polite laughter. She got real attached to a few of these watches after Dad passed, real sentimental about it. But some of us understand that Dad's legacy isn't about hoarding things in a drawer somewhere. It's about what they can do for the people still here. I felt every eye in that backyard shift toward me, waiting to see if I'd cry or argue or shrink. I did neither. I stood there, folder in hand, and let him finish. "So let's honor Dad the right way," Grant said, turning back to the table. "First up, the Omega Seamaster. Beautiful piece, real history behind it. Reserve is $200. Do I hear 200? Todd raised his hand. 200. 250? Grant scanned the crowd. I walked forward. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I walked to the front of the small crowd, set the document case down on an empty chair, and said, in the same even voice I use when I tell a donor's family that an item's provenance doesn't check out, "Mr. Calder, before any bids go through on that watch, I need you to check the back of the tag." The yard went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when something has shifted beneath everyone's feet before they've consciously registered why. Grant's smile flickered, but held. "Nora, this isn't the time." "I think it's exactly the time," I said. "Mr. Calder, there should be a small tag attached to the watch band, or in the case it came in. It has an accession number on the front. Would you turn it over and read what's written on the back, please?" Calder, who had been standing quietly to the side with the composure of a man who has done this exact kind of thing before, stepped forward and picked up the Omega with the careful, practiced hands of someone who has handled 1,000 pieces of valuable property. He found the tag looped through the band, a small paper rectangle with string, exactly as I had left it 8 months earlier. He turned it over. "This tag is signed," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, the auctioneer's trained projection making sure everyone heard. It reads, "Custodian and beneficiary, Nora Whitcomb." Signed and dated by Franklin Whitcomb, notarized. He looked up, first at me, then at Grant. "This is your father's handwriting, Grant. I recognize it. I've seen it on our consignment paperwork for years." "That's an old thing Dad probably wrote for fun," Grant said quickly, his voice rising just slightly. "It doesn't mean anything legally." "He never updated his will to say that." "He didn't need to," I said, opening the document case and pulling out the first set of papers. A signed, itemized inventory, dated and witnessed, transferring specific personal property to a named individual is a valid instrument independent of a will, especially when accompanied by delivery or clear designation of custody. I have every tag, front and back, photographed and dated. I have the consignment agreement Dad signed with Mr. Calder 18 months ago, listing every serial number in this collection, matched to these same tags. I have accession photographs taken the same afternoon Dad signed each one, at his kitchen table, with his own hand visible in several of them. I set the folder down on the table next to the watches, fanning out copies so anyone close enough could see. The notarized inventory sheet, the consignment paperwork with Mr. Calder's own handwritten appraisal notes, the time-stamped photographs. "Mr. Calder," I said, "you knew Dad for over 10 years. You appraised this exact collection with him present less than 2 years ago. Can you confirm whose property this legally is?" Mr. Calder didn't hesitate. "I can. Franklin brought these 11 watches to my shop himself in the spring before last. We went through them one by one. He told me directly, more than once, that everything except the Timex was going to Nora. He said it plainly enough that I wrote it into my own file notes at the time, because he specifically asked me to remember it, in case anyone ever questioned it later." He held up the Omega slightly. "This tag confirms exactly what he told me. I have no legal or ethical basis to accept a bid on this watch or any other watch in this collection. Without Nora's consent as the documented owner, you can't just stop the whole auction over one tag," Grant said, and I could hear the edge creeping into his voice now. The same edge he used to get as a teenager when a lie started collapsing in real time. "This is embarrassing, Nora. In front of everybody. Was this really necessary? You put my father's private legal instructions on a folding table in front of 40 people and called me sentimental for objecting," I said. "I think embarrassment was already on the table before I walked up here." A few relatives laughed, quickly muffled. The kind of laugh that escapes before people remember whose side they're supposed to be on. "Every watch in this collection has a matching tag," I continued, turning to address the crowd rather than just Grant, because I understood, in that moment, that the audience mattered as much as the paperwork. 10 of the 11 are legally mine, documented and notarized by our father before he died. The 11th, the Timex, was left to Grant specifically. I have no objection to that one being sold, if that's what Grant wants to do with something that's actually his. But the rest of these need to come off this table. "Let's check them all," Mr. Calder said, already reaching for the next watch, the Hamilton Railroad piece, turning over its tag with the same unhurried. "Custodian and beneficiary, Nora Whitcomb," he read aloud. He set it down gently and reached for the next. Grant's face had gone through several colors by this point, landing somewhere between red and the particular gray of someone watching a story they built collapse in real time in front of an audience. "This is insane," he said. "She's been planning this. Look at her. She brought a whole case of paperwork to a family reunion." "I brought documentation to protect our father's wishes," I said. "You brought a scholarship fund you never asked anyone about, and a story where I'm the villain for having proof?" Mr. Calder finished checking the remaining watches, one by one, reading each tag aloud in that same steady, professional voice, while the yard grew quieter and quieter. The earlier festive noise draining away into something more like the hush of a courtroom. 9 more tags, 9 more confirmations. Only the Timex bore no custodian note at all, just Dad's plain signature and a single line. "For Grant, so he remembers to show up." Nobody laughed at that one. I saw Grant's jaw tighten when Mr. Calder read it aloud, and for just a second, something that might have been shame crossed his face before the anger reasserted itself over it. If you have ever had to prove something you already knew was true just to be believed by your own family, drop a comment and let me know. It helps more than you'd think to hear you're not the only one. "I'm not selling the Timex today either," Grant said abruptly, snatching it off the velvet. "If she gets to keep hers, I get to keep mine." "That's fine," I said. "It's yours. Do whatever you want with it." I only ever asked for what Dad actually gave me, in writing, with witnesses. Calder set down his gavel, unused, and addressed the crowd directly. "Folks, I want to be clear, because I take my license seriously. I cannot, in good conscience, conduct a sale on property where legal ownership has been documented and disputed in front of me. What I've seen here today is about as clean a chain of custody as I've encountered outside of a courtroom. 10 of these 11 watches belong to Nora Whitcomb, plainly and legally, by her father's own signed instructions. I'm returning the auction reserve fees already collected, and I won't be facilitating any further bids on this collection." He began gathering the watches carefully, one by one, wrapping each in the small cloth pouches he'd brought, and handing them to me with a private nod that felt like the first steady ground I'd stood on in months. Grant tried one more angle, turning to the crowd with the same easy smile he'd opened the auction with, though it looked considerably more strained now. "I guess my sister wanted to make sure everyone knew how important she is," he said. "Some people just can't let things go." "I didn't need everyone to know I was important," I said quietly, packing the last watch into its pouch. "I needed Dad's actual wishes respected, instead of turned into applause for you at a scholarship fundraiser nobody approved. That's the whole thing, Grant. It was never about me being sentimental. It was about you assuming nobody would check." Aunt Marcy, to her credit, stepped forward at that point, her voice carrying the particular authority of the family member everyone still listens to, even after 50 years of nobody quite knowing why. "Grant," she said, "I think it's time to stop talking." He did, eventually. After a few more mumbled complaints about how nobody appreciates what I was trying to do for this family, and a pointed exit toward the drink table that put considerable distance between himself and the folding chairs. Several relatives drifted after him, the ones who I suspect were more interested in his version of events than mine, and I let them go without comment. I had learned over the preceding months that I did not need every person in that yard to understand what had happened. I only needed the truth to be documented, which it now was. Permanently, in front of a licensed professional and a small crowd of witnesses who would remember exactly what they'd seen. Mom found me afterward, sitting alone at the edge of the yard, with the packed watches in their case beside me, the document folder closed on my lap. She looked smaller than I remembered her looking, even at the funeral. her hands twisting the hem of her cardigan, the way they did when she was trying to find words that wouldn't make things worse. "I didn't know he was going to do it like that," she said. "I thought it was just going to be a nice thing. For the scholarship." "I know, Mom. I should have asked more questions when he took the box. I know that too." She sat down next to me, quiet for a long moment, watching the last of the reunion crowd disperse into smaller conversational clusters. The way families always fracture back into their natural fault lines once the drama has passed. "Your father would have hated seeing this happen," she said finally. "The auction, I mean. Not the paperwork part. He'd have loved that part. He always said you were the only one of the two of you who actually finished what she started." I didn't say anything to that, because I wasn't sure yet whether it was meant as comfort or just an old, tired truth finally being spoken out loud. 3 days later, Mom showed up at my apartment unannounced, holding a small paper bag. "I found this," she said, "in the garage, behind some old paint cans. I think Grant must have set it down and forgot about it when he was moving the watch box around." She handed me the bag. Inside, wrapped in an old dish towel, was Dad's brass loop. The glass slightly smudged, but otherwise intact. The metal warm from having sat in her car on the drive over. I held it for a long moment before I said anything. It was such a small object, worth almost nothing by any market standard, and yet it felt, in that moment, like the most complete thing anyone had handed me in months. If a small, ordinary object has ever meant more to you than anything expensive ever could, I would love to hear about it. Leave a comment. It's the kind of thing worth remembering out loud. "I'm sorry," Mom said, and I understood that this was as far as her apology was ever going to go, that she would not confront Grant directly, would not demand he apologize to me in turn, would not rebalance the scale in any way beyond this one small gesture of returning what had been misplaced. It was not everything. It was not even close to everything. But it was something true, offered without an audience. And I decided that had to be enough. Grant never apologized. I heard, through the same cousin grapevine that had once carried his version of events, that he told people I had made a whole scene out of some old family stuff just to look important, and that he still kept the Timex on his dresser. Unworn, as far as I know, a small daily reminder of a story he still believed made him the wronged party. I don't expect that to change. Some people would rather keep their grievance than examine it, because examining it means admitting the shape of what they did. And Grant has never been especially good at that kind of accounting. I have made a kind of peace with the fact that he may never come around, that the repair in this family will always be uneven. Weighted heavily toward the people willing to do the quiet, unglamorous work of it, and empty on the side of the people who aren't. I spent the following weeks doing what I actually know how to do, which is not confrontation, but care. I brought the 10 watches back to Cincinnati and set up a proper workspace in my apartment, the way I would for any collection coming into a museum's custody. Acid-free tissue, individual boxes, a fresh set of condition reports, updated to reflect their current state. I photographed each piece again, this time under better light than Dad's kitchen table had offered, and I wrote a short provenance note for each one, connecting the watch to its history, its previous owner, its meaning, the same way I would for any donor collection with a story worth preserving. I called a small local history museum 2 towns over, one that had recently done an exhibit on mid-century American manufacturing, and asked if they might be interested in a modest loan exhibit, a working man's watch collection spanning 4 decades, with an emphasis on the personal history behind each piece, rather than pure market value. They said yes almost immediately, delighted at the idea of something with real documented provenance and a family story attached. I am cataloging the collection properly now, the way Dad would have wanted. The way he asked me to, that afternoon at his kitchen table with the legal pad and the loop between us. The loop itself sits in my apartment now. In a drawer, I lined myself with a strip of blue felt. The same soft blue we use at the museum to cushion small, fragile objects that matter more than their size would suggest. I keep it there, not because I use it often, but because some objects are meant to be kept, rather than used. Held in trust, the way Dad trusted me. Quietly, without ceremony, simply because he believed I would take care of it properly. Every time I open that drawer, I see the small brass shape resting against the felt. And I think about the difference between the people who understand what something is actually worth and the people who only ever understood what a crowd would pay for it. I never got an apology from Grant, and I have stopped waiting for one. I got something better, in its own quiet way. The truth, documented and witnessed, returned to its rightful place. And a small brass loop resting in a drawer lined with blue felt, exactly where it belongs. If you stayed to the end of this one, thank you for sitting with it. If it meant something to you, leave a word in the comments before you go. It helps more than you know.